I'm Aren Lerner. I'm the author of the Beneath All Glory series, and today I'm going to be reading the first chapter of the first book, Beneath All Glory, Fort Orphans. Now, I hope you enjoy it. Chapter 1, Life at Fort Raven. Lizzie Rogers, are you still asleep? The voice of Louise, the fort cook, came up the ladder hall. It's past 6 o'clock. Are you going to sleep the whole day? Down in a minute, Louise, Lizzie called, quickly smoothing out the blankets on her bed and scrambling into her dress. She climbed down the ladder and skipped into the kitchen to get the water bucket. Aren't you a lazy lie-a-bed this morning? Louise scolded good-naturedly while she stirred porridge at the stove. Sorry, Lizzie laughed, grabbing the bucket and going out, shoving the heavy kitchen door closed behind her, as she hurried to the well to get water. Elizabeth Joan Rogers was Lizzie's full given name. She was 11 years old and a chore hand at Fort Raven in Nebraska Territory, a small army post that had been established along the Oregon Trail, between Forts Laramie and Kearney to protect the supply wagons, going from one fort to the other, as well as the travelers along the westward trails. The fort was a small adobe stockade with rooms lining the thick walls. On the lower story were the stables, cattle pen, garden, storerooms, kitchen, mess hall, and a few private rooms, and the armory. The upper story consisted of private rooms and barracks, and was reached by wooden ladders. An open courtyard took up the center. Fort Raven was garrisoned by a mixed company of infantry and cavalry soldiers, commanded by a Captain Stephen. Less than a half-mile from the fort, a little town had sprung up, that everyone called Old Town, a play on the good old town, which the soldiers had dubbed it when it was first being built. The name had stuck because everyone thought it was amusing, it being such a new ramshackle town, really. Most of the town's inhabitants were the tenderfeet who hadn't made it any farther along the Oregon Trail, and decided to settle there near the safety of the fort. Lizzie's parents had died along the trail in a cholera epidemic when she was a baby. Fellow travelers had dropped little Lizzie off at the fort while continuing on their way westward, and a kindly officer's wife had taken her in to nurse her. The woman left when her husband was sent to a different post, and Lizzie had been only 5. Since then she had been cared for by several other families, but now she was just working. Captain Stephen gave her a room and meals in exchange for her dusting and sweeping, and helping the cook in the kitchen, among other things. Lizzie had brown eyes, rust-colored hair that she wore in 2 braids, and freckles, which made the more proper ladies shake their heads and wonder what the world was coming to out here in the uncultured West. But Lizzie was too young to care, or too wild, they would add. There was another chore hand working at the fort, too. Andrew Lewis Black had been Lizzie's best friend, ever since he had pulled her hair the year before when he had first arrived. He was originally from a small town in New York, not too far from New York City. Andrew was the same age as Lizzie, and had no living parents either, but his father had died of bilious fever only 2 years ago, and he had been 6 when his mother died of consumption, due to weak lungs in the family, people said. Andrew's older sister Jane, who was 21, had taken a position as a maid for a wealthy family in San Francisco, and, as she couldn't take Andrew with her, had convinced Captain Stephen to take him in when they had stopped at the fort on their way to California, and he had agreed. Andrew worked in the stables and the armory and did other chores for the soldiers. He also worked with the blacksmith some, because his father had been a blacksmith before he died, and it made Andrew feel at home. Today was a beautiful morning in mid-April, 1861. Meadowlarks were singing a joyful chorus as they flew up into the brightening sky, and a soft breeze was blowing, bringing the tangy scent of sagebrush with it. "Mornin', Lizzie," the husky voice of Edwin Hollows, the Pony Express rider, sang out from behind her as she pulled the dripping bucket up from the well. "Have a letter for the captain," he said, sidestepping his horse over to her, and reaching down to hand her a fat envelope. "Thank you," said Lizzie, taking it from him. He touched the brim of his hat to her, spurred his horse, and galloped back out of the fort, a cloud of dust blowing up from the horse's hoofs. Edwin was an orphan too, like the Pony Express wanted. He was 14, and no one knew anything else about him. He appeared only when he had mail to deliver, and before you could think of anything to ask him, he was gone again. But he was the hero of all the boys who lived in the fort and town anyway, even more so than the soldiers, since the boys thought the life of a Pony Express rider seemed the most exciting and risky of all, traveling alone daily through wild country as they did. Lizzie brought the water back to the kitchen, then went to the captain's office to give him the letter. Knocking timidly at the door, she obeyed the faint "come in" that could barely be heard through the thick wood. Captain Stephen was sitting at his desk reading, but he started up immediately when he saw that she had a letter. News from the east was hungrily awaited and feverishly read, ever since the Confederates had bombed Fort Sumter in the Charleston, South Carolina harbor a few days earlier. Captain Stephen did not yet know if he and his soldiers would be called for, and was waiting to hear if the General-in-Chief of the Union armies wanted them to stay where they were or go elsewhere now that things were so tense in the east. Forgetting to thank her, the captain took the letter and tore it open, and Lizzie hurried back to the kitchen to help Louise with breakfast. She took the stack of plates and bowls and went to set the tables in the mess hall, since Louise informed her that the only other thing left to do was to fry the bacon. After breakfast, Lizzie went to saddle her paint horse, Dixie Red. As part of their duties, Lizzie and Andrew also took out the fort's herd of cows so they could graze. It was their favorite duty, too. "Good morning, naughty girl," Lizzie greeted the horse, letting herself into the stall, shooing a couple of chickens out and slipping the bridle over Dixie's ears. "How are you today? Impatient to get out and run? Going to be good today?" "Probably not," laughed Andrew, coming in to get his horse ready too. His was a buckskin gelding named Lupine, and he had a much more mild temperament than Lizzie's spunky mare. Lizzie smiled. Even if Dixie was moody, she liked her horse. "Maybe we can run away from those two lazy bones today," she suggested quietly into her horse's furry ear. "Maybe we can race them and leave them miles behind us, breathing our dust." "What are you whispering to her?" Andrew demanded suspiciously. "Plotting against us or something nasty like that." "Of course," Lizzie teased, leading Dixie out of the stall and snugly cinching the saddle. The little horse pinned her ears. I'm sorry," Lizzie said, swatting Dixie's nose away, when she swung around, ready to nip if things got worse. "Looks like she's grumpy today," Andrew observed, tossing the reins over Lupine's neck, and gently scratching the horse's black nose. Lupine blew affectionately into Andrew's hand. "She's always grumpy," Lizzie said, shrugging. They led their horses out to the cow pen and opened the gate. A big red heifer burst out, slobber swinging from her broad, pasty nose. The other cows followed her lead, and Lizzie and Andrew quickly mounted their horses and headed for the fort gates. "Be back before dark," Captain Stephen called to them, from where he was talking with the gun warden in front of the armory. "Yes, sir," Andrew called back, raising his hand in acknowledgment. He made a face at Lizzie over the cows' backs, as if he really cares. "Well, he probably meant for the cows' safety," she returned impishly, flipping a red braid over her shoulder and urging Dixie to a trot. "That must have been it," said Andrew. They shared a wide grin. Neither of them liked Captain Stephen, and knew he didn't like them either, except maybe for the work they did, and sometimes not even for that if they were too slow or negligent. The sun was just rising as they rode out, making every clump of grass and every rock cast a long shadow. Early Indian paintbrush and larkspur waved gently in the fresh spring breeze. Old Hound, the fort dog, came running out to join them, his pink tongue lolling out the side of his mouth. He was supposed to be the guard dog, but he seemed to think that everyone in the world must be coming to adore him, so naturally he greeted everyone in good humor, even when he shouldn't. He trotted along now at Andrew's side, and looked glad to be out and having fun. He had big drooping ears and was white with large spots of black and brown all over. Some sort of hound, people said, often disparagingly, because he wasn't exactly a pretty dog. But he was Lizzie's second best friend to Andrew, and she thought he was a nice dog no matter what anyone else said. "Let's race," Andrew shouted over the lowing of the herd, his dark brown curls blowing in the wind under his straw hat. "All right," Lizzie agreed. Then she added to Dixie in a low voice, "We'll win, too, won't we? And leave them far behind, breathing our dust, just like I said before." "Ready?" Andrew called. Lizzie nodded, and they kicked their horses and flew past the herd. Old Hound ran barking joyfully alongside them, but got distracted halfway by a big jackrabbit that bounded out of the bushes as they got close. In the end, Dixie won, and Lizzie was triumphant. "I told you we would leave you in the dust," she gloated, reining Dixie in and waiting for Andrew to catch up. "You wouldn't have if only Lupine hadn't almost stepped in a prairie dog hole just then," he protested. "It wasn't fair." "It's never fair unless you win," Lizzie laughed, nudging and impatiently prancing Dixie after a wandering gray steer. "Well, maybe you always cheat," Andrew grinned, to which Lizzie only sent him an amused smile. The morning passed lazily while the cattle milled about hunting for bits of new grass, and Lizzie and Andrew alternately chased straying cattle, chatted, teased each other, or climbed about on the rocks. Afternoon arrived with dark rain clouds gathering in the western sky. The wind picked up, and the cattle began to pace uneasily. Thunder rumbled, and old Hound sniffed the wind, his black nose twitching and ears blowing back. "I think we'd better go back to the fort," Andrew said, riding next to Lizzie and holding onto his hat with one hand. "Yes," she nodded, "we don't want a stampede on our hands." Well, he wasn't so sure they didn't. "In any case, Captain Stephen doesn't," Lizzie hastened to add, seeing Andrew's mischievous expression. "I guess so," he reluctantly allowed. "But wouldn't the boys in town like to hear about that? Maybe he'd near Edwin Hollows as a hero if he could tell about how he had saved all the fort cattle in a wild stampede, at risk of life and limb." Andrew was very touchy about the fact that he was an orphan, and was apt to try and show off, mostly to himself, that he could be as good as anybody else. And as he had a hot temper, showing off meant street fights a lot of the time, especially if someone had teased him about being an orphan, or about his looks, which some said were girlish, due to his curly hair and large dark eyes. As the breeze rose, they rounded up the cattle and headed them back in the direction of the fort. Dusty wind blew into Lizzie's face and whipped her skirts round her legs. Crows were circling against the dark sky, cawing loudly, and making the cattle skittish. Old Hound ran alongside the herd barking, nipping at the cows' heels. Lizzie waved her hat at them, trying to turn them in the right direction. Andrew yelled, attempting, without much success, to give a good blood-curdling Indian war whoop like Edwin could. Finally the cattle turned, and they drove them quickly back toward the fort while the rain began to patter down. By the time they got back to Fort Raven, it was pouring, raindrops beating down on the dusty ground, and dripping off their hat brims. Above the gates, the flag whipped about in the strong wind as they drove the cows through the door and to the cattle pen, where they eagerly hurried in of their own accord, knowing the time was drawing near when they would get their corn. Andrew slammed the gate on them and led Lupine into the stable. Lizzie followed with Dixie, took off the saddle and bridle, and rubbed the horse down. "Well, you were pretty good today after all, weren't you?" Lizzie talked to her horse, as she stuffed some fresh hay into her manger. "Sometimes you are, and sometimes you aren't. When am I ever to know?" Dixie gave a disgusted-sounding snort, tore off a mouthful of hay, and chewed it deliberately. Lizzie patted her horse's damp neck and went out of the stall. A few hens sat clucking softly to themselves on their roosts after escaping the rain outside. Andrew stood petting the officer's horses, water still dripping off his curls and sliding down his neck. The officer's horses, tall and sleek and handsome, were much finer ones than the ones Lizzie and Andrew were allowed to use. Dixie Red and Lupine were only little scruffy Indian ponies. "You're soaked," Lizzie laughed, seeing Andrew there. "You're dripping like a wet dog. You should go change or you'll catch cold." "Oh, who cares?" he retorted crossly. Cross, because he remembered his mother saying the same thing to him when he was a little boy, and he didn't like to be reminded that he didn't have a mother. "Never mind, then," Lizzie shot back, going out. You could never tell with Andrew. One minute he could be jolly and joking, and the next he'd snap at you, just like Dixie. That was the worst thing about him. Lizzie raced across the courtyard through the rain and climbed up the ladder to her room, changed into a dry dress, and went back down to help prepare supper. In the kitchen, Louise was chopping onions at the table. From Kentucky originally, Louise had come to the West a few years ago looking for work. She was singing as she chopped, "Camptown ladies sing this song, doo-dah, doo-dah," and she doesn't sound very nice either, being a terrible singer. Lizzie tied on an apron and looked around questioningly. "You can cut those, miss," Louise directed, pausing in her song and pointing with her knife to a pile of turnips sitting on the draining board. "They go in the chowder," she continued, nodding to a large steaming black kettle on the stove. Lizzie took a knife and started in on the pile. "Camptown racetrack 5 miles long, oh, doo-dah day." Louise picked up her song again, cheerfully scraping the onions into a big dish, then going to the spice cupboard and rummaging through it. Lizzie, happen to know where the cayenne pepper got to? I can't find it." "No, I didn't see it anywhere," Lizzie answered, busily chopping turnips. "Well, then it must be used up. You'll have to go get some in town tomorrow. I'm needing some more saleratus, too, and vinegar. Here, I'll write you a list." Louise took out a pencil and a scrap of paper and began scribbling things down. When Lizzie had been around 8 years old, one kindly lady from the fort had taught her to read and write, but that was the extent of her book learning. Louise put the note in the water bucket, where Lizzie would be sure to see it and remember it the next day. They went back to the cupboard to find something to take the pepper's place. After scraping the last of the chopped turnips off her board into the kettle, Lizzie took the stack of plates into the mess hall to set the long tables that lined the walls and filled the room. She lit the lanterns that hung from the beams of the roof, and carefully set out the plates and bowls and silver. The hall was cozy in the dim light from the lanterns, with the rain drumming softly on the roof. Lizzie paused for a moment to enjoy it before hurrying back to the kitchen. "You can take the biscuits in, too," Louise instructed over her shoulder while she stirred the chowder. Soon everything was ready, and Lizzie rang the big brass dinner bell. The soldiers came hurrying through the rain, joking and laughing, some of them with their wives and children, and the hall filled up rapidly. Lizzie sat down at the end of the table nearest the door to the kitchen, and bowed her head while Captain Stephen said grace. She and Andrew had a private joke that he sounded more like a judge reading a verdict than someone praying. "A verdict of a lifetime in prison," they would add, smirking to themselves. The prayer over, Lizzie hungrily waited as the pots and bowls of food made their rounds. And in the place where she was sitting, she got them last of all. She saw Andrew and watched jealously as he took a generous helping of the chowder and began to eat. Finally the food made its way down to her, and she could eat too. She was always so hungry after a day of riding out with the cattle. As she ate, she listened to the soldiers near her talking. "We won't let them run away like unruly children. We'll get them back if it takes a war," one of them was saying, emphatically waving his fork. "We will," averred another. "Lincoln won't let them ruin the Union just like that without any trouble, or soon the other states will start their own revolutions." Lizzie didn't really care about such things, so she stopped listening. They'd been talking like this for a few months now. Even if there was a war, it would soon be over, she thought dismissively, and it would hardly affect her even if it wasn't. The next morning, as soon as she had finished doing the dishes, Lizzie went to the stable to saddle Dixie Red. In preparation for going to town, she had put on her best dress, a brown plaid linsey-woolsey with a white linen collar. She thought it was ugly and plain, but it was the finest thing she had. Cinching the saddle snugly, she led Dixie out of the stable. Andrew went by with a bucket of oats as she mounted her horse. "I'm going to town. Want to come?" she asked, pulling her skirts down as far as she could when sitting astride, another thing that scandalized the ladies. "No, they're going to be training the young horses today. I was going to go watch," he answered, pausing and running a hand through his curls. "They're going to be getting them used to shooting from off their backs, and that's always a grand thing to watch. Don't you wish you could stay and see that too?" "No!" cried Lizzie, who didn't agree that it was a pleasant thing to watch. The horses were always scared, and she felt sorry for them. "Anyways, goodbye," she said, nudging Dixie forward and waving. "Bye," he replied. Lizzie rode out of the fort and down the road toward Old Town. Dixie sniffed the air and whinnied joyfully. "Nice out, isn't it?" Lizzie remarked contentedly, patting the horse's warm neck. The sun shone brightly, the air was fresh and smelled of the blooming rabbit brush that lined the road. Grasshoppers flew up in front of Dixie's hooves, their wings whirring. Lizzie sighed in the fine spring morning air, and exhaled with a deep, satisfied sigh. It was good to be out on such a lovely day, with a pleasant errand to run. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope that you will continue reading the books on your own. Thank you.